Okay, are we on? So we're working? Okay, cool. Well, thank you for being here. I thought on a Saturday night we might have like 10 or 5 or so I brought Jennifer, so we at least have 3, But really thrilled that you're here and grateful for the opportunity to share with you. Brian said we need to maybe do something on leadership, but I don't want to say but. I want to say, and leadership is not one of those areas that kind of is my expertise, or I don't have the leadership training that comes with a lot of places. So what I want to do is we're going to talk about leadership, but I want to do it through the lens of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. And we'll dip into verse 13 a little bit as well as Paul kind of wraps things up. And I think this is a really important section. So what I want us to do is kind of work through the text, and then let's draw out what we can see there that is about leadership and about a mode of being, a way of being in relationship with people. And then as we do that together, we'll take a break, and then we'll have a Q&A and talk about whatever issue you want to talk about. And I know how to say I don't know. I know how to do that, and that may happen. But that'll be a wide open sort of thing. We'll talk about navigating some issues maybe, or how a church navigates some issues in particular ways. But that'll be open. That'll be up to you what we talk about. So the Q&A will be your time, right? So to begin with, here we need to remember Thessalonica was a difficult experience for Paul. You remember he goes to Philippi. This is all in northern Greece, right? What would be called Macedonia at the time, up by the coast, up in the northern part of Greece. So Paul came to Philippi, and you remember he was imprisoned there and beaten and basically run out of town, though not. Paul kind of stiffened his neck a little bit and said, "You're not going to run me out of town. You're going to have to, come and ask me to leave. I'm not going to just go." But there was a lot of opposition there. And he goes to Thessalonica, and of course, there's opposition there as well. And he's not able to stay very long at all, maybe just weeks. But the opposition from Philippi followed him to Thessalonica, and ultimately he left Thessalonica to go to Athens. And he went to Athens by himself. But he did send Silas and Timothy back to Thessalonica and back to Philippi to check on the new beginnings of that congregation, of those congregations. And so as he writes a letter back to Thessalonica, it's probably the first letter we have from Paul. Some think maybe Galatians is the first letter. Maybe. But certainly 1 Thessalonians is at least the second, if not the first, of Paul's letters, chronologically. And it's a very pastoral kind of letter because it's responding to the concerns and the needs of an infant church. This new community that has already experienced persecution. Jason was drugged before the authorities, in Thessalonica. So there's stress and persecution in Thessalonica. This is a new group. How entrenched are they in their faith? How rooted are they in their faith? That is a real question. And what we see in 1 Thessalonians 2 is kind of a report that Paul gives about his relationship with the Thessalonians. So let's read the text and then talk about it, walk through it a little bit. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. You yourselves know, brothers and sisters, that our coming to you was not in vain. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully mistreated at Philippi, as you know, we had courage in our God to declare to you the gospel of God, in spite of great opposition. For our appeal does not spring from deceit or impure motives or trickery. But just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the message of the gospel, even so we speak not to please mortals, but to please God, who tests our hearts. As you know, and as God is our witness, we never came with words of flattery or with a pretext for greed, nor did we seek praise from mortals, whether from you or others, though we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. So deeply do we care for you that we are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. You remember our labor and toil, brothers and sisters. We worked night and day so that we might not burden any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how pure, upright, and blameless our conduct was toward you believers. As you know, we dealt with each of you like a father with his children, urging and encouraging you and pleading that you lead a life worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and glory. On account of this, we give thanks to God. That's just the first line of verse 13. On account of this, because of this history we have with you, this intimacy we have with you, this life we have with you, on account of this, we give thanks to God. And it begins in verse 1, and the New RSV leaves out, I think, an important word here. Maybe your translation has it. But verse 1 has the word because or for. Because. You yourselves know, because. Because you yourselves know. About what? Well, about the persecution, about the struggle that is in chapter 1. But notice, well, let me ask you, what word do you see here kind of repeated? What idea is kind of the basis for what Paul is talking about? How does he address them? You. What does he say about them in terms of the you? In fact, it's a word he uses several times. No, you know, right? You know. And this is used like in verse 1, verse 5, remember in verse 9, you are witnesses in verse 10, you know in verse 11. Why that kind of emphatic? You know, you remember, you were there, right? You know me. You know what this was. You know that relationship we had, all right? So there's a kind of an assumed intimacy that Paul has with this group of people. All right? So I don't think we should just say, you know the facts. I think that would be too reductionistic. It's not that you just know the facts. You know the experience. You know what it was like for Timothy and Silas and myself to be among you. Right? You have a memory of that. Right? Now, let's unpack what that memory is and what he appeals to. When you look at the first 3 verses, the first 2 verses is sufficient, I think, for right now. What words stand out to you there? What gives you a context for how Paul is going to describe his way of being among the Thessalonians? What's that language there? I'm sorry? Courage. You know it took courage, right? And why is it that they could see courage in what Paul was doing? What did they know about Paul? What he's been through. Like the words, what you suffered, right? Or what other language do we have? Mistreated, right? And then there's another word. It may not come up in your translations so easily, but in verse 2, in spite of great opposition. Now, do you have a different translation for that, anybody? In verse 2? Great, I'm sorry? Great opposition still? Much conflict. It's actually the word much agony. This is the word Jesus agonizes in the Garden in Gethsemane. Much agony. So there's this struggle. Is not just, and I think that word agony would indicate not just that Paul has an external struggle, being mistreated, but there's an internal struggle too, that there's an agony that is a part of what he's experiencing. Right? So I like that courage then is a highlight here. Paul comes to Thessalonica in a courageous way, given his experience in Philippi and what his experience will be in Thessalonica as well. You know what happened to us. So there's kind of a sense of self-sacrifice in that, self-giving in that. Paul is willing to experience the struggle, the opposition, the hurt, the mistreatment for their sake, right? Now, let's go to the next couple of verses here. So in verse 3, Paul says his motives or his practice do not arise out of, okay, what's my motive? It's not, what? 3 things there in verse, is it verse 3? Yeah. Yeah, deceit. What else? Deceit, impure motives, and trickery. All right. Anybody have different translation for trickery? Deceit, impure motives, or unclean motives, and trickery. Trying to trick you. Trying to get you into something that's going to help me, right? Trying to trick you into my cult so that you can reverence me, so that it can be about me, or something like that. Trickery either in terms of the miracles, or trickery in terms of the promises. Paul says, look, There's no deceit in what I'm doing. There's nothing shameful or unclean or hidden about what I'm doing. I'm open, I'm honest, it's out there, and I'm not trying to trick you. I'm just trying to tell you the gospel. I'm just trying to share the good news with you. I'm not trying to manipulate you. Okay, can you hear leadership principles in that? I'm not going to manipulate you. I'm not going to deceive you. I'm not going to make it look rosier than it is. I'm not going to try to trick you. Right? I'm going to tell you straight up. Be honest with you. Right? So when we see that, look at then why he thinks that's so important. For our appeal does not spring from deceit or impure motives or trickery, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the message of the gospel, so we speak, and this is such an important phrase, so we speak to please who? God. Not who? Not humanity, not mortals, not people. When leaders are people pleasers, things go off the rails, right? Because it's no longer the gospel that guides us. It's no longer the gospel that forms us and shapes us. People pleasers will manipulate, right? People pleasers will deceive. Because they're interested in pleasing people, because what does that do for them? Makes me feel good, right? And no conflict. Oh, we want a church with no conflict. Let's just please everybody and keep everybody happy. Well, if that's the standard, we've already substituted something for the gospel. Right? Because the gospel is rooted in pleasing God. Not Jesus pleasing others, but pleasing God. Right? So that's a really important point that Paul says, you know me. You know how this was when I was with you. Right? So when you're looking at, let's go down a little bit further here. Let me make a point on verse 4. We have been approved by God, verse 4, to please God who tests our hearts. The word approved, you see in verse 4, your translation may say tested or something like that. And the word test in verse 4, at the end of verse 4, it's the same word in Greek. In other words, God has tested Paul. It's not approval in the sense of God said, oh, Paul, I approve of you. No, Paul's been through a process of testing. God has tested him. Because if you're going to be a leader, the heart needs to be tested. God tests hearts. That's a common theme all the way through Scripture. Genesis 22:1. And God tested Abraham. Or Deuteronomy chapter 8. God tested Israel in the wilderness to see what was in their heart. Or God with Hezekiah. When he brings the Babylonians in, God tests the heart of Hezekiah to see where his desires lie, right? To see what's inside. Testing is a kind of a surgery on the heart. It's an opening of the heart to see what you're really committed to. What is really important to you. And it's the heart that's going to tell us whether we're people pleasers or whether we're God pleasers. Whether we're just interested in gathering a bunch of people who like us or whether we're interested in being formed by the gospel. Which means some people are not going to like us. Which is what happened to Paul, right? Goes to Philippi. Ends up, some people don't like him. Goes to Thessalonica. Some people don't like him. Well, Paul's not interested in pleasing everybody. He's interested in pleasing God by being the voice of the gospel. Right? So as you look at verses 1 through 4 then, what are, and maybe I've already said some things here, just I've left this kind of open. What characteristics, what characterizes his conduct? What language would you give to that? What characterizes Paul's conduct? How would you describe it? What's your language for what he's just described here in these first 4 verses? Any ideas? Faithful? Okay. Faithful works, right? Faithful to God, pleasing God. Yeah, that works. There's not just 3. That's just kind of lines I left you, you know. And honest.
Committed,
No deceit.
sincere.
I'm sorry?
Committed or sincere.
Committed and sincere. All right. Okay. Very good. Yeah.
He's earned the right to speak, and they'll listen to him.
Earned the right to speak?
To speak.
Yeah. In what way did he earn the right to
That's
speak?
what he's been through.
Okay.
To prove that he's somebody that, through his example, that he
Okay.
wants us to know that he's somebody that we can.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. I think about that self-giving or that self-sacrifice. The courage to enter into a space where you're going to face opposition, and you're doing that not because it feels good, right? You're doing that for the sake of the other. Right? It's other-centered, right? Which is what the gospel is. You know, don't consider yourselves greater than the other, right? Humble yourself. This is what Jesus did. This is the pattern of the gospel, that though he existed in the form of God, he did not hang on to that equality with God, but he emptied himself or humbled himself, you could translate it, and became a servant, right, for the sake of others, right? So, and therefore experienced the cross. So yeah, I like that's a good point to think about that way. Any other ideas that you've seen here?
I think he's certain of the power of his message.
Okay, the gospel. Yeah, that's something that comes up over and over again in this reading, doesn't it? What word gospel is used? Maybe 4 or 5 times. I didn't count them up. So, but something like that. But the message is important to Paul.
Space to be more easily courageous,
Mm.
in addition to everything else we've already mentioned.
Yeah. So the message becomes part of the importance here. The motive, the message, and somebody mentioned model as well, which we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But this kind of, when you're thinking about what a good leader is, do they know the message? Do they know the gospel? Do they embody the gospel? Do they live out the gospel? And what motivates them? You know?
I think with that, part of their attitude, their confidence in the faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Confidence. Paul comes with confidence here because of what the message means in his life, and what the message means for us. Yeah, good point. Good point. Well, I hope you got 3 out of that you can fill in there. You know, I think you covered what 3 I would say. So, yeah. So let's move into the next section then. Verse 5. Notice he begins with, as you know. Again, that intimacy. As you know, and as God is our witness. Nice little oath he takes there, right? So if you don't, you know it, but God knows it too. We never came with words of flattery or with a pretext for greed. So no flattering, right? Can you imagine that situation? Have you experienced people that's how they manipulate you with flattery? You know? It's how they get you on their side. That's how they get you to join their cause. Is it by a flattery? That's really superficial stuff, isn't it? Well, I think you can see some of that in there, yeah. I think that's true. I've seen it in churches of Christ, the sense of flattery. I mean, sometimes even these celebrity preachers or celebrity pastors, you just, and I'm not going to pass judgment on these because I don't know them, but you get a sense sometimes that this is more about them than it is anything else. And that's unfair to say, in a general way, or even in a specific way. But I think Paul is talking about something that we might perceive that way, that he comes in flattering and uses that as a mode of manipulation.
Neither of those modes are enduring.
Are enduring, right, yeah.
In terms of leadership principles,
Okay, very good.
they are not enduring.
Yeah, it's because it's so superficial, isn't it, to be a flatterer? That's just so superficial. The second one is, we didn't come to you in flattery, we didn't come to you out of what? Greed, right? We didn't come out of this making money. We didn't come here to make money. Now, there were a lot of traveling philosophers that did. Traveling philosophers, there's a whole group called the Cynics who traveled around the ancient world, and they would find a group that would then pay them and support them in their philosophical teaching, or they would try to find a benefactor, a patron who would then support them in their teaching. But Paul's pretty clear that's not what I'm interested in. You think about in 1 Corinthians, Paul has the same sort of thing going on, right? In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I came to you in Corinth. I could have asked for resources from you to help in my ministry, but I didn't. I didn't seek those resources. Because I don't want you to misinterpret what I'm doing here. I want you to know that my motive is pure, that my gospel is pure, that you're not going to be able to adjust my gospel by pulling purse strings, right? And he sees it as a kind of modeling of how to live with others. You don't live with others to get things from them. You don't live with others to siphon off their stuff, or to siphon off their flattery, or to siphon off their their commitment. Rather, it's about the gospel, right? Now, not only greed, but we come back to that same principle, right, that we mentioned earlier. We don't use words of flattery. We don't seek praise from mortals. Or we don't have the pretext of greed, and we don't seek praise from mortals. It goes back to that, who are we pleasing? Pleasing God, not pleasing others. Praise from mortals, though, is an interesting phrase. Because the word praise is the word doxa, glory. Glory. We don't seek our glory from human beings. We don't seek our glory from the praise we get from other people. As if the praise we get or the affirmation we get becomes the driver in our leadership, or the driver in our way of being in the community. And that is such, I think that's a point that needs to be integrated into our lives in a healthy way. Affirmation's a good thing. We need to be affirming each other. Right? Nothing wrong with that. But if I am driven by the need to be affirmed, and that's why I do what I do, then that is a cancer inside of you. Because you'll never be affirmed enough, right? You'll never have enough glory. You'll never have enough praise. If that's what's driving us. I became a preacher primarily to get my dad's attention. That was the bottom line when I was 12 years old. My father was a preacher. He was a workaholic. He would tell you that himself if he were alive. And he apologized to us kids about that later in life. And so he recognized that he gave his work more attention than his children. You know. For example, I don't remember my dad being at any ball game, any of my ball games. He was doing Bible studies 3 times a week at night. You know, didn't have time to go to my ball games. Now, that's my kid's memory. That may be wrong. You know, that may be just my bad memory. But at least it impresses me. It's impressed on my consciousness, you know. So I finally figured out what would get his attention. And that would be, I started reading books in his library. And I started giving talks in church. And he would take time to help me with those talks and walk me through those talks. And I would have time with my dad. Right? And so I began that journey of becoming a preacher or a minister of the gospel out of a motive to be approved by my dad. Now, is that a bad motive? Yeah, it's not the fundamental motive we should have. But God used it to work in my life. Right? Ultimately, that motive changed. Right? But God used it along the way. But if I had kept that motive, or I had transferred that motive to, I just want to be well known. I just want to be a celebrity. I just want to be the person in my congregation that everybody turns to. I want to be the celebrity in my congregation, or whatever that is, right? Whatever that looks like. I think that's what Paul's talking about here. That we do not seek glory from human beings. We don't. That's not the glory we seek. In fact, he'll use the word glory again in verse 12, and it says the glory that we're looking for, or the glory that we're seeking, is from the God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. We want to participate in the glory of God, not generate our own glory. Right? So as you look at verse 7, what is it that Paul wants to be among them without 2 things at least that I see in the text. I don't want to do it this way. I don't want to be this. What do you see? Verses 7, 8, 9, 10. I don't want to be this sort of, or have this sort of relationship. I mean, verse 7 is, yeah, not the demands, right? Though we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. What do you hear in that? Is Paul saying we should never make any, we should never have any commandments or something like that? What kind of demands is he talking about? We didn't demand something of you as apostles of Christ. Support? It could be money, could be support, because that's certainly something that comes up again, doesn't it? We wouldn't, I think that's the other thing, we're not going to burden you. We're not going to make demand, without demands and without burdening you. In other words, we don't want anything in this leadership style here. We don't want anything that coerces you through demands. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Authority or whatever, because of who we are, you will answer,
Okay. That's good. So it's kind of like acting out of duty, right? And command structure. And that's not what Paul wants. That's not even what God wants. God doesn't want that. God wants a relationship, a mutuality, a sense of communion, a sense of being in participation in this together. So we didn't come to you making demands, which is another way to manipulate somebody, right? Is to make a demand. And we didn't want to burden you, right? And that comes out in, further down in verse 9. You remember our labor and toil, brothers and sisters. We worked night and day so that we might not burden any of you. We don't want your coming to faith to be a burdensome thing. We don't want to put any obstacles in your way. We don't want to make you jump through hoops, right, in coming to faith. I think there's that sense. And here he's talking about, of course, we were not a financial burden to you. But we can have other kinds of burdens that we place on people, expectations we place on people that have a sense of coercion or manipulation. Yeah. So Paul uses two metaphors here. Let's talk about in terms of this model. Two metaphors. And it's a mother-father metaphor. Right? What's the mother metaphor here?
Nursing mother.
Yeah, a nursing mother. What do you get from that? What is Paul saying about his way of being in Thessalonica? That he's like a nursing mother. What does that say?
He's there to nurture and nourish them.
Okay, nurture, nourish. All right.
That reminds me of the scriptures of the difference between milk and solid food. And
Okay.
they're really at the phase of trying to bring up new Christians in faith
Mm-hmm.
and just trying to establish that base
Okay.
foundation, and that requires nurturing.
Okay. All right. So the milk metaphor, you can think about extracting a milk metaphor from this text and think, where do you begin? You begin with the gospel, right? And you proclaim the gospel. And from there you build you build the temple on the basis of the gospel, right? So yeah.
It's difficult sometimes to have that leadership with a group of people if they have not grown up in a nurturing home.
Mm.
To really genuinely show them what it means to nurture and love one another in the
Yeah.
field, the father and mother relationships. If you grew up like I did in one that was not healthy.
Mm. Yeah. So, a mother metaphor might turn people off, right, because of their relationship with their own mother, right? That's certainly, that's a reality we have to address and think about. As Paul is using this metaphor, we talk about nourishing, talk about milk, but put that image in your head of a mother nursing their child. How are they treating the child? What's that bonding that's going on, right?
That keeps coming to my mind is tenderness.
Tenderness, okay, tenderness. Some of our translations say gentle, right? There's a problem there. Some Greek manuscripts say infant, and other Greek manuscripts say gentle. because there's only one letter difference between those two words in Greek. And so you can imagine how somebody copying a manuscript might miss a letter or add a letter. But either way, I think you still get the same point. Because Paul is handling the Thessalonians like a mother who nurses her child, or a nurse mother, right? And when you get that image in your head, there is a tenderness, there's a gentleness, there is an intimacy, there is a connection. I think all that metaphor is giving us a world to live in, right? A narrative to live in. When we think about it.
Back to the whole flattery thing.
Mm.
The reason I'm not flattering you is because I trust you enough to be able to give you the truth, knowing that you can handle it, knowing that it's what you need.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So that goes back to the message. I'm going to give you the message honestly, right? Not with flattery, not with a kind of, let me see how I can make this sound good for you, and adjust the message so it sounds better to you, right? Yeah.
A nursing mother is also fiercely protective.
Oh, there you go. Fiercely protective, a nursing mother, right? You can kind of get the image of protection. Yeah, that's good. So what's the other parental metaphor here? It's father, right? So what does this metaphor convey about leadership, about what is Paul talking about when he uses this metaphor of father? I'm like a mother to you. Isn't it interesting? Paul is willing to use both genders as a metaphor for his relationship with the Thessalonians. But what's the father about? Why use the language of father here? What is that trying to convey?
He does need to be a leader, but he also needs to, I mean, my father always was like, examples. And by being an example,
Mm-hmm.
we might not even know it,
Yeah.
but later in life, I come back and would think, he did that because he wanted us to learn a lesson
Mm-hmm.
by showing us, hey, sometimes like you were saying earlier, it's not about us.
Yeah.
The true leader is not gonna be, look at me, it's gonna be giving the examples,
Yeah.
leadership of being out there and doing things sometimes some people don't wanna do.
Okay. So the father metaphor takes us into kind of a modeling, maybe a training, discipline. That you get that image. Discipline is an image that comes with the image of father, right? We get that in other places. Yeah. Hey, Tammy.
So when I think of father leading, like holding a child's hand and walking with them, rather than a ruler who's giving down demands, the father's walking.
Yeah. The father here is not kind of the authoritarian, make demands kind of father, right? That would be contrary to what Paul just told us. We don't want an image of a father that is in conflict with how Paul says this is the way I was with you. I didn't make demands. So it's not this authoritarian top-down thing, but it is a leader in the sense of one who is pleading and exhorting and training and calling. Yeah, you had your hand up.
Yeah. Well, he's a reflection of what he's teaching them as a leader and what he believes, so he's got to be steadfast and firm in his faith, and I think that's kind of what he's projecting as the father.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. He sees himself as being both a mother among them. He can use feminine characteristics or feminine, even stereotypes, I guess, even, but a feminine understanding of how to lead and a masculine understanding of how to lead. And he doesn't see those two in opposition, that they're both kind of functioning together, that he is both of those as a leader, right? Yeah.
That father word, he uses the words, we encourage you, we exhort you, we charge you.
Yeah.
All of those in following that father expression.
So I think maybe kind of a big picture might be training, like a father trains his son in a particular, or apprentices his son in a particular occupation or something like that. Yeah. Yes.
Pleading seems like the odd one out there. How does
Yeah.
it look in that context?
When you, I see pleading here. It's actually the word testify. Testifying. Anybody have a different translation than pleading?
This is comfort.
Comforting?
Urging,
Comforting?
comforting.
NIV says encouraging and comforting and urging.
Urging. Okay, so you
Which word is
got,
the pleading?
yeah, pleading is the last one.
So urging.
Urging. But it's actually just the word testify. Testimony. Which you could take as kind of a pleading, to testify to something.
Like we said, demonstrating by example.
Yeah, demonstrating by example.
Testimony.
So I don't think we should make this only about what comes out of our mouths, right? But it's about his whole presence. The fact that he earned his own money, the fact that he had the courage. Or, if we go back up a little bit, where is it here? Oh, yeah, verse 8. When he says, we wanted to share with you not only the gospel, but what does he say? What else we want to share with you? Yeah, our very souls, our very lives. In other words, when we want to lead people into the gospel and we want to lead people into a worthy way of life, which is the language there in verse 11,
It's their
we need to be able to unveil ourselves, right? To show ourselves. There's an assumed kind of intimacy. And we need intimacy with people that we're going to lead. Did I cut somebody
their
off?
action, how he treats them, verse
Mhm.
11. And you know that we treated each of you as a father treats his own children.
Yeah.
He responds to them, how he interacts with them.
Yeah, that's good. Responding and interacting, father, child. Yeah, good. But we not only gave you the gospel, we gave you ourselves. We were in this. We were part of this. We unloaded, we took our most intimate and most constitutive dimension of ourselves, and we gave it to you. We were all in. Yeah.
If that's a model, it should produce the right type of love.
Yeah, exactly. So when we think of it in that way, this is why Paul could be so hurt by the church. Leaders can be hurt by the church, right? Well, I won't ask for a show of hands, but that can happen. And one of the reasons it happens is because leaders are giving of themselves. It is something that arises out of their own identity and their commitment to the gospel and their commitment to the people, to be a mother to the people, to be a father to the people. And mothers and fathers can get hurt by their children, right? But it's the risk leaders take. Because we know there's going to be opposition, and that's why we need the courage. And so Paul says, that happened to me in Philippi. it can happen again.
You could write that book up with the word no as well.
Yeah.
The fatherly figure, and especially the statement that's made about leaders getting hurt from the church because the church knows these
Mm.
things. They
Yeah.
know how certain things are supposed to be,
Mhm.
certain requirements or whatever, and just do those things.
Yeah.
Instead of-
Well, as you know, in verse 11 it says, as you know, he's talking about kind of you know what I acted like when I was with you. You know my demeanor, you know my ethics, you know my relationships with you. But when it comes to what the gospel is, yeah, that message, Paul's not adjusting that message in order to win more people. The message is sufficient, right? Yeah. Notice that last line in verse 12, that you lead a life worthy of God. To lead a life worthy of God. That is, the word lead there is actually the word walk. To walk. Walk a life. No. Worthy. Now, we don't like to use that word sometimes because worthy sounds like legalism or, something like that. And, yeah, you got to be worthy. Well, no, none of us are worthy in that sense. Right? But we are called to walk in a worthy way that reflects the gospel, of God, of who God is, and the very nature of the kingdom itself. So Paul says in Philippians 1, verse 27, live worthy of the gospel. Right? Or in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, walk worthy of the gospel, right? Of your calling. Recognize that this moment is not something we have invented for ourselves so that we can make a splash. This is a calling from God to lead that life. And that we as mothers and fathers, forming and nurturing and exhorting a congregation, the goal is not me-centered. The goal is that they might walk worthy of God. That's a very important difference there. What is our goal?
He never loses connection with God. He says they're approved by God, tested by God. God is witness.
Yeah.
And he never loses sight of in it all. It's always God knows. God is always kind of that rounding point.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. That God is kind of the center that everything revolves around, connecting back to God. And that then gives us a healthy self-image because of who God is, right? Yeah.
Kind of makes me think of him saying too, we represent God.
Yeah.
We need to be worthy children. We represent him to the world, So let them see that in our lives.
Yeah. No, that's good. No, that's good. The last thing on the page there, Paul's response, thanksgiving. It's interesting in Paul's letters, he always has some note of thanksgiving for the people he's writing to. As leaders, we need to learn to develop the habit and the practice of gratitude for whom we're leading. Finding gratitude in the church. We can find problems in the church. That's easy. Right? That's not hard. And people can get on Facebook and they can talk about all the problems in their church, and that's an easy thing to do. But I think we're called to see gratitude, to experience gratitude. What are we grateful for in this group of people? This people we're leading. What can we give thanks for? Can we name it? You know, one of the habits that's been a part of my life on occasion is, you know, a gratitude list. Because gratitude reorients our mind, right? And I think as we approach our congregations, maybe thinking about, okay, what am I grateful for here? What's good here? What can we name that's good? What can we celebrate that's good? And so Paul, as he's writing to the Thessalonians, is willing to say, for this reason, because what God has done among you, in my experience with you, in our relationship, we give thanks. And that, you know, maybe leader meetings ought to begin with gratitude rather than, okay, what's the problem tonight? You know, we begin with gratitude, maybe we will have more grace with the problems, right? Because we see the good as well as the problem, yeah. Or the challenge, if you don't like the word problem, the challenge. Now, on the back side, very briefly, because I know we need to take a break, and I need to go get my hearing aids out of my car because I forgot to put my hearing aids in, which is why I've been straining a little bit. Like, okay, I think I know what you said. But some broad principles. This is just my jotting of broad principles. Motive, please God or please others. Greed, is it for money or is it self-giving? Nurture, sharing ourselves or seeking flattery. Honesty, transparency or hiddenness, deceit, right? Calling, living for the kingdom rather than for ourselves. Presence, I think the parental images, metaphors are about presence as well. You can't lead people you're not present with. Right? You have to have some kind of connection to, intimacy with, sharing life with. You know? And proclamation, the good news of the kingdom over against self-aggrandizing rhetoric. I think the thought there that I have is really one of the more fundamental things when I think about leadership. Navigating change in a congregation, dealing with, you know, relational issues in a congregation. One of the first questions I ask when somebody says, we're thinking about talking about this at our church and maybe moving in this direction or that direction. And what I suggest to them is the most important thing is, does your congregation trust your leadership? Do they trust your leadership? Does the leadership know the flock? Do they know them? Do they know them in an intimate way, in the sense of, have you been there at their bedside when they were sick? Have you been there in raising their children? Have you been there in their struggle with illness? What kind of relationships do you have? Is the relationship kind of just a Sunday morning relationship? Well, there's no trust built there. You can't build trust just in a Sunday morning service. You have to be in lives to build trust. And if a congregation is going to navigate its problems or try to navigate new questions that you want to address, if there's no trust between the leadership and the congregation, there's no real knowledge between them. And Paul says, you know what we are like. Does the congregation know their leaders in that way? And if there's no trust, it's going to blow up. It will blow up without trust. Guaranteed. Right? If it doesn't blow up, at least you'll lose 30% or whatever, Trust. So I think a well-lived life, a well-modeled life, builds trust. And trust then enables authentic leadership. You can't lead people who don't trust you, because they're going to always question whether you are doing this for yourself or you're doing it because you've already decided what you're going to do. When you get those kinds of responses from people, you've already decided what you're going to do. It doesn't matter what I say. There's no trust there, right? There's no trust. And that will be disruptive and damaging. One last thing, I'll fill in these blanks for you. 1 Thessalonians 5:12-13. So Paul is saying, hey, this is what we were doing among you, and there are still people working among you. There are people who are laboring among you. You as a congregation need to have this response to them. You need to respect those who labor among you. You need to esteem them highly in love because of their work. You don't esteem them because they have a PhD, right, or something like that. You esteem them because of their work. Yeah? And the last thing he says to them in that verse is, be at peace among yourselves. Be at peace. So that's kind of the response. Now I think you have that response from leaders. Or that response to leaders, I should say. When you have the sort of relationship that Paul describes in verses 1 to 12 of chapter 2. If you don't have that relationship, it's hard to respect. Let me say it this way. Ephesians 5 verse 33 says, husbands, love your wives so that. Now that's not how most translations go at it. Most translations say, and wives, respect your husbands. Like there's two commands, right? But there's no command to the wife. The wife is not commanded to do anything. That's not an imperative in verse 33 of chapter 5. Literally what it says is, husbands, here's the command, love your wives. You're commanded to love your wives. And then there's this little Greek word, hina, which means so that, or with the result, or the purpose. Husbands, love your wives so that wives respect their husbands. Leaders cannot expect the congregation to respect them if they don't first love them. Right? And that's the bottom line, seems to me. So let's take a break and then we'll just have a conversation. I'm going to go get my hearing aids so I can hear with the conversation.
There's coffee back there. You guys want that?
Let's just come back in about 10 minutes. How about that? And we'll go to about 8.